Thank you very much, both for the invitation and the good introduction to me and my work. I will share my screen and then get started. You see it full screen?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So what I will do today is that I will talk about, let's say, the most recent work that we have done and that we have building up since, I can say, 2014, when I started at Chalmers. And that is about pedestrian movement modeling. And I will also shortly talk about the work that I did before that indeed was published in the book Space Matrix, which we use, let's say, actively and integrated with a more sort of perspectives that are developed and methods that are developed in the space syntax field and community. So in a way, that was also the start of this new research group that we called SMOG, was to integrate these two approaches within urban morphology. One, talking about building types and morphologies that actually sort of starts from the work of Leslie Martin and Stedman and people like that. And on the other hand, space syntax that is very much studying the street networks and how that affects pedestrian movement. And we integrated these. So I will sort of walk you through that. And I will start by talking actually a little bit more about density, and then I will end with a tool that we have developed very, very recently, which is called Urban Calculator. And below on the picture here, you see the whole team, because of course, let's say this kind of work you never do alone. There is a research team that works together, let's say, and trying to bring the field further. And there was also a lot of external connections that I will not mention now, but just that you know, let's say, there's always a lot of people behind the work that is presented by one person. So let's get started. And I actually, when I got the question to talk today, I thought, let's look a little bit, let's say, how actually urban science provides evidence for urban design. And one in relation to density that is still, let's say, alive and kicking and always repeated and repeated is the work of Newman and Kenworthy, showing the relation between density and car usage and thus energy usage, which you could say has trickled down in recommendations about how to develop sustainable cities by UN Habitat on the right side here. And my work spins around density, or has very long spinned around density. And actually what urban science also does is to sort of problematize and enlighten and get and sort of give a better understanding of such concepts that actually very often are much more complex than one in first instance thinks. And this is the model actually that we developed, including several variables to measure density, and through that, by combining a set of variables to measure density, we could actually pinpoint down and describe building types quantitatively. So these three images that you see below here have the same floor space index or floor area ratio. So they have the same density, you could say, but they actually are very, very different in their urban form and the qualities that we sort of, when you walk through these areas, that you would experience. And through the space matrix model, we actually show that they also, in terms of density, if you look at it in a more sort of advanced manner, actually are very different. Yes, FSI is the same, or floor area ratio, but all the other variables are very, very different. The coverage of the area is very different. The building heights are very different. The open space ratio, so the pressure on the unbuilt space, is very different. So they are only the same in terms of floor area ratio. In all the other instances, they are very different. So that's the core of this space matrix model that we developed. And then later, we continued with that by measuring density, not only at the plot level or at the neighborhood level, but actually started using floating boundaries. Meaning that if you measure the density in a walking distance of, let's say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes surrounding your building you live in, what is the density then? And if you project that in the space matrix model, you see that the dot of the density starts to move, dependent if it's a very homogeneous or heterogeneous area. In this case, it's a very heterogeneous area, so very close to the building you live, you have a certain density, but if you start walking, the density changes. So your building is an exception in a neighborhood with another density and typology. This definition of floating boundaries or using accessible density to measure density can actually be used to start measuring density on whole cities, and through the space matrix model actually develop or map the typology in a city. This is Gothenburg, and the colors represent different building types, but at the same time also all the density variables that are embedded in that typology. So this is kind of a mapping of density and typology at the same time. And that you can do for many cities and start comparing, and what types are more represented in one city and not in another, etc., which we have done in the group and compared London, Amsterdam, and Stockholm, and then 3 cities in Sweden of different size. But what it also does, let's say how we contribute, let's say, to urban design is actually that we problematize the impacts, for instance, of density. And I've done a systematic review of what are actually the effects of density and densification. And then the one that we have been focusing on a lot, where Newman and Kenworthy comes from, is the transport. And the bar shows in the darker colors when a lot of empirical studies have shown, yes, indeed, this contributes in a positive manner to sustainable urban development. We reduce car usage, we walk more, we cycle more, etc., etc. But you see also in the systematic review, we showed that there are actually negative social impacts. There are negative health impacts. There are negative environmental impacts. So yes, transport is very positive, but there are also negative side effects. And this is the big challenge of urban design, which is, I think, very well reflected in the work of Kate Raworth with donut economics, that we have to deal with, let's say, the concepts of planetary boundaries, where the reason why we have said that we should densify because it reduces the impact to climate change based on the way how we develop our cities. But at the same time, we have to handle the concept of social boundaries. And there we come into the social impact of densification and the health impact. And we have to find a safe zone in between. And that's what this whole concept is about. This was actually kind of an introduction. So let's move to the main focus of what I would like to talk to you about, and that is modeling pedestrian movement. And why would you want to do that? One thing is it supports this. It's a support for sustainable urban development through sustainable transport systems. It reduces environmental impact of cities, and it supports health and well-being. So that's the reason it's of great importance for urban designers to understand what is the logic of pedestrian movement. And of course, this sort of what you need to do that. So if the goal is to inform urban design, we have to go back to, okay, then we have to understand what the physical environment, how it contributes to pedestrian flows. And we have to understand how pedestrian flows then impact issues of segregation, issues of local economic markets, of gentrification, etc., etc. And then you can inform urban design. But let's go back. I think there's one more image. And then the issue is that very often, if we find these correlations between the physical environment, flows, and social processes, we draw very quick conclusions in urban design. And we develop models like the 15-minute city or the strategies for sustainable urban development like UN Habitat that are often rather crude. What I think is needed is design support tools that actually acknowledge the complexity of what we find in urban science so that it becomes useful in urban design. And that's what the group, my research group has been sort of pushing forward. So we do very fundamental research, but we also go all the way to develop tools to be able to disseminate the results. And if you do so, there are three things that you have to think about. One is that if it become useful for urban design, we have to represent urban form in a meaningful way, meaning that it should not be just numbers, it should be representing urban form. Like I showed with the density, that you need this more advanced model actually to really capture the typologies, because then you become meaningful in urban design. Second, use planning parameters that are known in the early stages of a design, because otherwise you cannot predict anything. Third, use simple models. So with the fewest parameters, have the biggest explanatory power. So instead of having big data, have small data, but still be very predictive. And if we then go to the other side, okay, if you what to do then? First, finding this meaningful way of representing urban form, or the areas that we work with. And in terms of pedestrian movement, of course, the network approach is the most meaningful. And there's a lot of research done by others, let's say, and I would say the space syntax of community and research field is the most sort of powerful and successful in that sense. So we build further on that. And then use planning parameters known in the early stages. And that's where the powerful things come in. If we only use, and that's what we have been trying to do, we only use street centrality and build density to predict or to explain pedestrian flows. And that we have done in Amsterdam, Stockholm, and London. So we have been in many, many different areas. We had 19 areas in Stockholm, 227 different street segments. In Amsterdam, 80 neighborhoods, in London, 60 neighborhoods, and did pedestrian counts, and then tried and then correlated that to aspects of build density and street centrality, and found that we could explain 65% of the variations in pedestrian counts in these almost 60 different neighborhoods and almost 1,000 streets, which is kind of amazing. With actually very few data, you can explain so much. But we wanted to go further. We wanted to make the models even simpler and even more directly talking to urban designers. So we went back to the types, both the density types, and for the streets, we also developed a typology based actually on the centrality measures. And you could say that we have identified street types that have a very high centrality on the local scale, but then they drop on the higher scales and vice versa. It's kind of a multi-scalar street typology. I cannot cannot go in depth on this, but this is it's kind of summarizing all the centrality measures that are used in space syntax in a typology. And we use that and could explain 55% of the pedestrian movement. And you see this in bars. So what you see here is that depending on the density type you are in, you see that the pedestrian counts increase. Depending on the street type you are in, you see that the pedestrian counts increase. So the city streets have a very high count, and the high density, very compact neighborhoods have also a very high count. We can also see that the fluctuation also depends on the density type. So what you see in this diagram, it's a lot of things that are going on here. But first of all, you see the different street types. Those are the vertical columns. You see that the pedestrian counts increase if you sort of not look at all the details, but you see that they go up. You also see that the same goes for the density type. So what you actually can see here is that the combination of the two is very, very explanatory. But it also tells you that every density type neighborhood, so villa areas and very central high dense areas, all have back streets with the lower counts and high streets with the highest counts. So this is a very, very informative information for an urban designer. Now we come to the question, okay, having said all this, this is just informing urban design in a way. It's not giving them a tool to assess what they are doing. And that means if we want to do that, we actually have to go one step further. So we don't want to have explanatory models. We want to have predictive models. So we want to estimate the expected pedestrian flows in areas where we do not have empirical data. And we don't want to have just a rule of thumb. We actually want to know a new bridge. How will that impact both the existing streets, but also this new bridge? How many people will walk there? And this is what we are working on at this very moment. So what we do is that we ask the question, can a model that is trained in one city predict pedestrian flows in another city where we assume, or no, where you don't have the data of the empirical data of the pedestrian counts? We use our studies in Stockholm. So we have all these empirical data that we already gathered earlier. And we built a statistical model there that is very good in explaining the pedestrian counts in Stockholm. Then we use that model and predict Gothenburg, another city in Sweden. And we have actually data there, so we can validate if what we predict also is sort of represents the real counts. And what we found until now is that if we control for density, or better yet, the density type, as I've been talking about, the predictive model becomes better. This confirms actually what we have been doing earlier in other studies. What we also found is that the pairwise interaction between the variables that we have improved the predictive power of the model. This is also confirming actually earlier findings of our research. The third thing, what we have found when we have been started exploring and making this predictive model, is that if we add some validation empirical data from Gothenburg in the model that we developed in Stockholm, so we kind of put some real data of the case, the city that we are interested in the predictive model, it suddenly improves very much the predictive power of all the streets in Gothenburg. So we only need what we found. So we have been testing, okay, if we add 5 streets, if we add 10 streets of Gothenburg, 20, 30, 40, how much does the model improve? And actually we found that until 10, so to add 10 street counts from Gothenburg in our Stockholm model improved the predictive power very, very much. Adding more didn't help. And this is actually interesting because that means that if you go to a new city, you don't have to measure the whole city. You don't have to know all the counts in the whole city. Or if you have a new area, you don't have to do the counts in all the neighboring areas. You just need 10 to increase your predictive power of your model. This suggests that building a robust general predictive model, like we did in Gothenburg, in Stockholm, can be made specific for the case, in our case, Gothenburg, by adding just a limited set of collected empirical data of that area. And we were triggered actually to do so because this is done a lot in ecological studies where they do counts of birds and counts of other, let's say, species that are threatened. So we use the way they have been thinking to develop this predictive model. This is ongoing work, so it's not published. We are sort of in the middle of this explorative study to develop this predictive model. At the same time, we have been developing a tool that is a design tool called Urban Calculator, where we ideally, if we manage to have this predictive model, can actually add a layer of counts in the streets of new streets that you will add. So what you can do in this tool is you have a network of a city, you have the density types in the city, you can add streets, you can add buildings, and then calculate the new centralities, the new densities, but also the pedestrian counts. And that was it. Thank you for your attention. I can, if you want, show you the tool in real, but let's see if there is if there are questions or interest to do so. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Just so we can delve into some of this work, and it's quite fascinating to me personally to see the references and the connections to the work that's come out of the Martin Center historically at Cambridge University, and then the UCL Space Syntax School that has kind of worked with street networks rather than the more broad concepts of the built environment that the urban morphologists at Cambridge were dealing with come together in your group. Is very elegant and I think fascinating. First, I'd like to maybe lead off with a question of how the research that your group has done has been received in practice and influencing actual decision making in urban design or city policy. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think there's a growing number of pedestrian models around the world that are being developed with different approaches. Some are based on sort of morphological relationships, like you presented, where there's certain correlations between location, centrality, density, and the observed pedestrian traffic. Others have done more kind of individual microscopic models that actually model individual movement per each segment by agents or in other network analysis methods. And then a lot of these models are being developed, but so far fairly few are in sort of real world practice and then influencing decision making. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how successful you guys have been in terms of working with city governments where you're based or where you do the research in actually getting them adopted in practice.
Yeah, so we have a lot of connections and a long history, let's say, of working together with them. So we have, I didn't talk so much about that, but we have what you said in the beginning, we have a tool which is called the Place Syntax tool, which is more an analytical tool to both analyze. I mean, all the things that I've been showing you can do with that. That tool is used quite a lot in the Swedish context. I also know it from the Netherlands that it's used there. So that tool, it's a QGIS plugin. And that is also continuously developed because we have questions as researchers, but also because we get questions from practice and then we implement, let's say, new additions and things. So that has quite a long history of being implemented. Also, the space matrix, which actually is not a tool, but it's a method in that sense, is used quite a lot. I think the reason is that that's also the reason I set up my presentation like this. There are a few things that you have to have in mind. It's what are the variables that are key at a certain moment in the decision-making process when you make plans. And those should be embedded either in your method or in the tool that you develop. And very often it's too complicated or you need to know too much at a moment that you don't know that yet. And then it becomes quite useless to have a tool. But I should also say that many of the things are much more advanced than the questions that are out there, so we also have difficulties with sort of getting through so we have a much easier time the closer we are to the community, when we talk a lot to them and we have a lot of presentations and they are really in, than if you go to a new municipality, for instance, that is trying to implement this in their daily practice. That's a much harder, more difficult process.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So the second up, I think what's fascinating because you presented both the interrelationships with ground coverage density, the sort of space matrix framework, and also the more network-based pedestrian flow modeling framework, it's oftentimes I find it challenging to communicate very clearly how certain metrics that we can apply on urban form have very real-world relevance, and not to just urban designers, but also politicians and community members, etc. And when you talk about density, that's maybe one of those things that resonates the most, because density is related to a gazillion other urban outcomes, whether it be the businesses on the city streets, or land values and economic development, or the feasibility of public transport, or investment decisions of all sorts of, where should we be putting public money so that it benefits the most people, whether it's parks or street furniture and lighting and better paving and all that. In some ways, the work on both density and urban networks may be able to inform a lot of these decisions. And so how do you see that there's do you see that people are able to make these connections from this analysis to why that they should care, why that would be directly relevant? Or do you think that there's still a gap in the field where we need to do a lot of translation and unpacking about, well, this metric captures this specific thing, but that specific thing is related to X, Y, and Z, and so many other things that one actually cares about and worries about on a daily basis. How well do you think, as a kind of field of urban morphology, these metrics and their implications on urban decision making are broadly understood?
Yeah, I think that I think when you talk about this, so what I've experienced when I present and I talk and what I've been hearing about, let's say, how these concepts and measures, how they matter, I think you come through. It's very clear that this plays a role. Let's say that how density relates to all these kind of factors. I don't think that is questions or that is difficult to sort of to give that message. I think the problem is in a way that in urban development, let's say in general, let's say that designers, planners, politicians, we tend to talk about the outcome, about the processes, about the, let's say, the shops that are there or not there, and we then forget to go back, but what are the reasons and the mechanisms, and then you come to centrality and the network measures and density, and those we can influence. But that is sometimes difficult. So to come from density and say how it impacts, that story is quite easy. But if you then try to change, let's say, I want to make this a high street with a lot of active frontages, to then say that it is you should just take care of the centrality of the street and the density measures, that to go back, let's say, the route is harder. And then we start just to making these active frontages, but actually we have to create the conditions for them through density, through centrality. So I think the story from density to the impact it can have is easy, but if you are talking about the impact, we have still forget very, very often to go to the creating of the conditions to get there. Yeah, I don't know why that is. Because if the one message is easy, why then it should actually be easy to do the other way around also. But actually, it's much more difficult, and we tend to stick to the impact that we want to have.
It was, I think, very interesting. Also, in the course of the semester, one of the speakers we will have will be Jan Geel, and the kind of approach that Geel has brought to the field is very much been historically focused on the quality of a particular space itself. So how well is a public space design? But I've always thought that this could connect really elegantly with you combine the place quality with the contextual factors, because at the end of the day, you can't have you can't attract people to a bunch of successfully designed places if they are just not spatially in a context that favors their use in a way. So that it's very complementary, I think, to that kind of place-based urban design approach. One quick last question, which is a bit more technical, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A from Ari. And this has to do with the kinds of models, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think when we look at the sort of history of space syntax approaches to understanding movement on city streets, then one could, I think, characterize that approach generally with finding correlations. We can't really get to causality or very fine-grained predictability because we have pretty high-level concepts that, okay, there's a certain centrality measure for a street, and that tends to correlate with pedestrian densities. And then if we add to that, for instance, density metrics that I believe would really improve the measure and have a more nuanced land use picture of a location. But we're still working with correlating morphological metrics vis-a-vis pedestrian densities. And then it's not maybe so different in concept with approaches that some American urban planners have also been using, where they take maybe perhaps simpler morphological measures, just population density, just job density, intersection density, public transit, and then correlate that against it. We get to maybe more nuanced metrics with space syntax and place syntax, but in concept is a similar approach. And on the other hand, in the transport community, there's folks who have been trying to model individual behavior multimodally, so from vehicles to public transit. And this involves an extremely detailed, extremely data-hungry approach where we have to have a very detailed land use setting. We model the choices. We do a mode split model and estimate how many people may walk versus take transit or drive. And then once we have those mode choices, we can go ahead and also model route choices and destination choices. And essentially, the prediction that we get out of these models are individuals modeled, and it's not a correlation analysis between one set of variables versus another, but it's actually modeled behavior, agent by agent or actor by actor. And so what are your thoughts in these two types of modeling? It's very different. The transportation models tend to be very data hungry and pretty hard to specify, but at the same time, they get to much more fine-grained when it comes to the actual results and may have stronger predictive power, but the kind of correlation analysis of urban morphology versus pedestrian activity is a lot simpler to expand and implement. And if it gets you to the sort of 80% mark, or I can't remember, was it the 65% on average across the cases you showed, is that like there's a trade-off in scalability versus specificity, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. I think, let's say, it has to do with in which phase and which scale of planning you are working in, which of the models is of more interest. Actually, the predictive model that we are developing is actually a project that is called Crowd Movement, and we do both. We actually go from the aggregated flows. That's what we try to understand. So all the individual behavior combined. And then the statistical models are pretty good to use. And then you can zoom in a street crossing where we move to agent-based modeling to predict the individual movement on the crossing. And there we use actually two different approaches. And then the aggregated flows become the input, starting data, so to speak, for the behaviors on the crossing. So it depends on the question you have. You cannot use that to predict this agent-based modeling. It's kind of too much to do a whole city. Why would you do that? Let's say you don't need that. You're not. And I think so that's a very sort of for what do you use it? I think another big difference is that in the agent base, you build in kind of the behavior in the agent, and in the behavior you have a relation with the surroundings, while the network approach, the behavior is built in the network. That's in space syntax, let's say, that's the core in a way of why, and there's a lot of theoretical papers written, let's say, why is it so good to relate or to correlate with pedestrian movement, it's because they have built in the cognitive, the cognition through space in the way you represent space. So it's a very, I mean, they are fundamentally different, but that's a more theoretical discussion. Let's say what is of more interest. But I think even there, that is very much relevant if you want to understand what the spatial structure creates for affordances for city users in general, if that's what you're interested in. We are not in, I mean, in that sense, on that scale, you're not interested in individual behavior. It doesn't matter if you go from A to B in a certain way. It doesn't, I mean, we want to know how this space is relatively different in terms of pedestrian intensity than another place in the city, because that is important to understand where economic activities will take place. This individual behavior is not so relevant for that.
Right. Okay, well, let's hear from the audience, mediated by Ari. Please, over to you.
Yes, let me kick it off. Thank you so much for the presentation, Professor Berghauser Pont. It was great to hear your views. And I think your book on space matrix has been foundational to how we think about urban form. And actually the first set of questions are related to exactly that. So sort of your initial stages on how you measure and define density. And so specifically, people were wondering whether, for example, your FSI measures are context specific or if they're absolute measures. And then related to this, could you also speak to us a little bit more about the data that you usually use to compute these measures of density? And also whether these, like, it seems like most of your work has been also cross-sectional in the sense that you measure it in a point in time. And I was also curious if you could also expand on whether you see sort of value of producing these types of measures in several periods of time to track how density is changing in different places.
Yes, very interesting questions, all of them. Let's see. So the way we measure if they are absolute or context dependent, let's say different approaches. So when I developed the space matrix in the beginning, it was the absolute measure. So we actually defined the morphological units in a way ourselves, or the neighborhoods that we calculated the density for. Which is for the development of the method, it was very good that we did it like that. But then if you want to map whole cities, it becomes very hard, because then you have to demarcate the city in bits and pieces and then start to measure. So then we moved towards this accessible density using floating boundaries. And what you do then is for each and every address point or building, you calculate its specific density in a 500-meter catchment area, or a 200-meter catchment area, or a 1 kilometer catchment area, depending on your research question. You can sort of, or where you're interested in, you can define that. So you get a specific, you get different values for each address point or each building that is context defined, and how much context you define by defining the radius. And that is actually at the core of this PST, the place syntax tool that we have developed over the years, where you can do these kind of measurements. You can also do that accessibility to schools, etc., etc. But then we use it to measure accessible density, both FSI or floor area ratio and GSI and open space ratio, etc. And then the data we use, also that has been evolving. So when I developed the method together with Per Haupt, we actually went out and really checked the data. So we got data from the municipalities, we checked it because we didn't trust anything that we got. So we went there and checked it through, I mean, you have the floor, you have the plans of the city and you know the building footprint, and then we check the heights of the buildings and check the data that we had. Nowadays, we do, to scale up, we use laser data very often. So you have the footprint of the buildings, you use laser data to know the heights of the buildings, and then you can, we have done a lot of studies also to, let's say, how you get from that to defining the gross floor area of each building, because you have to know the heights of each floor, etc., etc. So it's a whole process. But also there we went, let's say, from having the manual approach to really be sure about the data. We have moved towards an automated approach. Was there one more question or not? There was one more or not related to space matrix.
Which is, I guess, related to your last point about scaling up. It was just like whether you see potential of conducting these measurements in several periods of time and whether you do that.
Right. Work. Yes. And yes, there is a lot of potential. There is only a difficulty of getting the data because the laser data is not available back in time. But we have actually, so we have done a few of these historical data exercises. And actually what we were interested in then is how centrality, street centrality and build density, how they match and not match over time, or that one follows the other. So we have, for Gothenburg, we have a time series back until 1950, I think, for both data sets. So we have done a few of those exercises there, so that it's extremely interesting to do so, to see how planning actually, how infrastructural changes, that changes centrality, follows up by densification processes. And we are trying to add also green areas to that, because there is a lot of discussion that densification comes with the sort of the drawback of that the accessible green areas reduce. So actually want to also have historical data on that to add to that. So it's extremely interesting, but hard at times with data.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue to Stephen Leonard's question. Stephen, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask your question. It's about the use of open spaces and green spaces. So I thought it was a perfect segue.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Stephen Leonard. I'm working with the New York City Department of City Planning right now, but I used to work with NYC Parks. And we engaged in an effort to try to measure how many people use the New York City park system, which is about 2,000 properties over 30,000 acres. And we found it a very daunting challenge because those 2,000 properties have all different kinds of entrances and they're not controlled. And it was going to be like millions of man hours to try to actually physically measure, all the people that went in and out in any kind of statistically meaningful way. And so very interested in the idea that this methodology, which is used to predict pedestrian presence on streets, might also be used to predict the usership in an open space network. Is there any work that's being done that might be able to advance that idea?
Not that I know of very specifically going into green areas. But in the sense, so no, I have not, let's say, a clear answer on that. Of course, there are a lot of studies after the pandemic or during the pandemic that have been working on this, because we saw these huge changes in how open green spaces were used. So there is quite a lot, but these are very often very rough data sets that are used, so not specific to entrance points of park areas. So they're more crude. So this part of green areas or part of the city is used more. But I think there might be something to get there. But I think in general, I mean, our street network model. So we often work with we have a motorized model and we have a non-motorized model. And in the non-motorized model, we have the paths in the parks included. So when we do our counts, we don't make a difference. Let's say if it's we actually go into the parks and do the same thing. So I think the same methodology could be used. And also there, I suppose we could fine-tune the models that they become specific for parks, like I showed for Gothenburg. Let's say that you only have to have a few counts to increase, let's say, the predictive power for specific areas like parks. So that could be a way forward, actually.
Thanks so much. So I'll follow up with a couple of questions about pedestrian prediction. And so some people were wondering or wanting to learn a little bit more about the granularity of the predictions. So in particularly, they were wondering whether the predictions were annual, daily, were they all at the street level? And for example, whether you've also documented how they change with weather or other environmental conditions.
Yes, there are in the presentation I put the references, let's say, so there are papers where we describe this in detail. I think so. What we did is that we went to these 3 cities, Amsterdam, London, and Stockholm. In all and then in each of the cities 20 areas, and each area we had like 20 streets. And what we did is we had we counted mobile phone pings, and we had boxes on every street corner. So what we knew is how many people were counted from one street corner to the second to have the flow through that street segment. So that's what we use. We used a number of people in a street segment, and we counted for a full day. So from I think from 6 in the morning until 10 in the evening, in all these different streets, only weekdays. But it's not, let's say, we don't have fluctuations over the year, for instance. So we have fluctuations during the day. So we have that's the reason we could also see peaks in the morning and midday and evening, and they differ depending on which type of area you are. Let's say the suburban low dense areas have a peak in the morning and in the evening, while the most dense areas have a slowly increasing pedestrian count. They also have the peaks, but it's also gradually increasing. So we saw different patterns during the day in these different areas. But there's a lot of detail in the papers that we have published.
Just to clarify on this very point, Ari, I think when it comes to the prediction part of the model, that has no time variation. There is no weather or time in it. That's just one value, right?
At the moment, it's only one value. Then actually, because we saw quite clear differences between the density types, so that often are areas. So you could actually also predict the fluctuations during the day based on that. But for now, we only do, let's say, the number in the street segment. That's true.
Makes sense. And so a follow-up on the pedestrian prediction that I thought was very interesting was brought up in the chat by Mary Taylor, was related to predictions for different groups. So for example, a person experiencing a disability, or many sort of the heterogeneity on the prediction, right? Like, have you also explored, for example, how the quality of the built environment affects that prediction? Let's say whether they have sidewalks, the quality of that sidewalk, things like that.
Yeah, so we are exploring that whether there are indeed other variables, like actually the width of the pavement for pedestrians, or whether there, I mean, in European cities you always have it. I mean, there are very few streets where you don't have any pavement, and you have to go outside of cities. But yes, we have a few of those that we test. We haven't found actually, what we found plays a role is the speed, the allowed speed for cars that seems to play a role. And then you can think of, let's say, that's probably the noise exposure that plays a role. But otherwise, we find actually that it doesn't improve the models, the things that we have been exploring now. I should also say that we actually tried, like I said in the presentation, we are exploring this, so we add actually a lot of variables and testing and testing and testing. But we also would like to have, I mean, it should really do a job if we add it, because we want to create simple models. We don't want to have, let's say, very, very data heavy models. Great.
I know we're out of time here. I would like to welcome everybody in joining me with a thank you clap for Professor Berghauser. Pont. Thank you so much for joining us today. Meta, if you have a minute, please stay on the line and we can go on to a breakout room just to wrap up in a moment. But I wanted to share with everybody that next Monday, in fact, thematically, things tie in quite nicely because our speaker is indeed the current director of the Martin Center at Cambridge University, which came up at the beginning of the discussion, where a lot of historic work has come from on urban morphology. So Professor Ying Jin will be talking about why urban designers feel so constrained by their project briefs and what can liberate them. Future options for cities in the UK. So please join us same time, 12:30 next Monday with the Zoom link for registration. So with that, I will share also the chat session with you, Meta, after the call, but I'll set up a quick breakout room and we can maybe just continue the conversation really briefly. And